Hello, I'm Robin. Welcome to BookSpin, and welcome to another book review trio. So I've got another 3 books I'd like to discuss with you, starting off with Night Walk by Bob Shaw, published in 1967. This is my second Bob Shaw novel after having read 1 Million Tomorrows earlier this year. And once again, we have a high-stakes political thriller with some rather outlandish sci-fi concepts that amount to an entertaining read. This book is set in a future in which interstellar travel is possible via a technology called the null space drive, by which spaceships can travel across vast distances across points in space called portals. The way these portals can be navigated is quite complex, and I can't say I fully understand the scientific premise behind it, but the important thing to know with regard to the plot is, despite the vast size of this interstellar travel network that we've created with 80,000 portals across null space, precious little has actually been discovered in terms of habitable worlds out there in the cosmos in which humanity could potentially settle. There is one other planet, though, which is called M. Luther. And M. Luther has just one continent and has been settled by Lutheran humans, where they've set up their own society there. It's a theocracy with very strict religious laws. And the relationship between Earth and M. Luther is a little distant. It's actually a kind of Cold War of sorts. Now, word spreads to Earth that M. Luther has in fact discovered a new planet with Earth-like conditions which is ideal for colonization. And because there's this Cold War in place, and this is very highly sensitive information, there's a kind of race to get there. But of course, M. Luther has that critical information. So what happens is the Earth government send a spy out to M. Luther, and the spy is called Sam Talon, and he's our POV character, and he is on a mission to uncover the coordinates of this new planet. And this is all the backdrop to the start of the story, because all of this has happened by the time the book starts. And at the start of the book, things kick off right away as we follow Talon after he's arrived on M. Luther, and he is captured by the secret police on that planet. And while he tries to escape from them, a particularly vicious cop shoots him in his eyes at close range. This doesn't kill him, as you might expect, but it does blind him permanently. And then he is sent to a prison for political prisoners called the Pavilion. And from there, he befriends another blind inmate and also a sympathetic female worker who works there. And they work together to try and find a technological solution to resolve his blindness. And he hopes to use this technology, should he find this solution, to help him escape the compound and continue his mission. And this is, I think, where the most interesting piece of technology comes into play in this story. And Talon has an obvious talent for invention and engineering. And he comes up with this idea for a device to connect a camera to his optic nerve, which would allow him to see via kind of artificial eyesight. This experiment fails, however, but he does find that it's possible to use this device to remotely connect to someone else's eyes via a signal beam. And he calls this invention the eyeset. And what it does is it allows the wearer to see through the eyes of another person or another animal nearby, and he can choose which creature to see through using a proximity selection feature. So he uses this device to regain his sight in a limited way, to see the world again, but as you might imagine, it's quite a disorientating experience. It's quite hard to apply in a practical sense because he's moving around in his own body while looking through the eyes of another creature. But he sets out on his escape voyage using this device, and at first he carries a little bird with him, a little tame bird in a cage, and he uses this bird to help him see. Later on, he upgrades his companion and he adopts a little dog who proves to be a more reliable companion and a more useful pair of eyes. So he gives this dog the rather apt name of Seymour. So in order to gain line of sight vision on something, he has to lift Seymour up and hold him next to his face. So Talon sets out on his quest to escape the planet. Now, most of what I've described so far happens quite early on in the book, so I don't really consider that to be spoilers, but I'll just give you a vague description of what goes on from here. So he sets out on his escape journey, on his mission, and he faces many trials and tribulations, and what turns out to be a pretty epic journey. His blindness and his reliance on this strange technology proves to be a bit of a handicap when he's a fugitive on the run. But sometimes it can also be quite useful technology because he can apply it for surveillance purposes. So I won't say any more about the story, but it's definitely an entertaining and enjoyable yarn. It's pretty fast-paced. The technology on show is definitely intriguing, even if it's far-fetched. There's a fair amount of political intrigue in the mix, which adds to the suspense. So it's a neat little story. I do think, however, aside from the sci-fi ideas, it's not a particularly memorable story. And I think part of this, the reason for this, is none of the characters stand out. So, for example, the cop who blinds Talon at the beginning, he remains his antagonist throughout the story. And he's basically a very one-dimensional archetype of a villain rather than a proper character. And similarly, Talon has a romantic interest whom he meets on M. Luther. And I mean, she's a bit more interesting. She's described as a particularly beautiful woman with very high social status. But she seems to just fall in love with him for no particular reason, no compelling reason. So I found that kind of hard to believe. Talon himself is fairly interesting. He's obviously very intelligent, very scientifically capable, and he shows enormous creativity and fortitude in accepting his physical problems and overcoming them. But still, this is not really a novel you would turn to for deep or compelling or interesting characters. It is quite a neat story, though, and it works well as a spy thriller with sci-fi concepts, even if those concepts are a bit ridiculous. It's not my most memorable read this year. I think I enjoyed his Bob Shaw's 1 Million Tomorrows more than this one, and I'm very much looking forward to Other Days, Other Eyes, which I picked up recently and I've heard excellent things about. So Night Walk, I think it suffered a bit from forgettable characters, but the concepts were intriguing. 1 Million Tomorrows also had quite forgettable characters, but the ideas in that one were so absurd, so outlandish and remarkable that the story stays with me. So I enjoyed that one more. So I'm going to give Night Walk a score of 3 stars. And that leads me on to the second book, which is Journey to the Centre of the Earth by Jules Verne. First published in 1864. So we're going way back for this one. This is, of course, a classic adventure story that's been read and reread and well loved over many generations. I'm pretty sure I've read this before in my childhood, but I only have vague memories of it. More recently, I've read 2 other Verne books. I read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which I loved, and From the Earth to the Moon, which was just okay. From the Earth to the Moon had a kind of quaint charm to it. It's quite humorous, but also a little boring. So I'll put Journey to the Centre of the Earth somewhere between those 2 books. I enjoyed it. It's got a kind of timeless classic feel to it, but it didn't blow me away. But let's talk a bit about the story. So, Journey to the Centre of the Earth. This story is told from the point of view of Axel, who is a young mineralogist from Hamburg. His uncle, Professor Lidenbrock, is an eccentric geologist who, at the start of the novel, comes across a mysterious old parchment which is revealed to contain a coded runic message from a 16th century Icelandic alchemist. And this contains a secret passage. It describes a secret passage to the centre of the earth via a volcano in Iceland. So, somewhat against Axel's will and better judgment, his uncle compels them both to go on a mission to follow this path and follow their predecessors' footsteps down into the bowels of the earth to try and locate its centre. So they set off on an expedition to Iceland, where they hire a local guide, whose name is Hans, to assist them on their crazy, perilous journey to the depths of the earth. I say assist them, but really Hans is actually an instrumental character in the success of their voyage and to their survival. And he constantly proves to be the most reliable and resourceful of the 3 of them. So Verne spends a good chunk of the novel setting the scene and exploring their exploits in Iceland prior to their descent into the volcano where their real adventure begins. So I'd say something like at least a third, maybe a half, the first half of the book is setting the scene. He does a great job of evocatively describing the beauty of rural Iceland and the rustic hospitality they receive at the villages where they stop off. It reads something like a quaint and charming travelogue. And this writing style continues throughout, even once they go underground and they face much more action and much more danger. It maintains this kind of quaint style. And once they are under the Earth's surface, they encounter numerous strange phenomena and terrifying dangers. It's quite incredible just how often they manage to pull off ludicrous escapes from mortal danger from things like lack of water, intense heat, starvation, and fierce subterranean beasts. Anyway, it's a neat little adventure story, quite quaint in style, as I say, but it is a 19th century book after all. I think one thing that Verne does particularly well is the characterization of the 3 travellers and the character dynamics between them. So you've got Professor Lidenbrock, who is a classic eccentric academic. He's both pompous and stubborn. And once his heart is set on something, there's no stopping him. However, in moments of crisis, he shows that he can actually be a tender and loving person. And then you've got the narrator, Axel, who, while he's pretty intelligent, he's also quite a meek character and is compelled to follow his uncle no matter what, and even when he's very reluctant to do so. He's also in love with the professor's goddaughter, who's called Grauben. And the other main character is Hans, the Icelandic guide, and he's very taciturn and he seldom displays any emotion, but he is extremely loyal and dependable and resourceful. He always finds solutions to problems and he navigates the trio out of danger, and without him they would never succeed. So I really like the character dynamic between these three people, and I mean, in some ways they're all archetypes of a sort, but their interactions with each other make for some very absorbing storytelling. There's also some pretty interesting sci-fi ideas, or proto-sci-fi ideas, I guess you could say, because since science fiction as a genre hadn't been properly conceived or defined until some time after Jules Verne's death. Things like prehistoric creatures living in a vast underground sea, underground groves of giant mushrooms, clouds that produce an atmosphere within this huge subterranean vault. It's all very imaginative. It's a very creative world that he creates. But I will say, I don't think these concepts are as interesting or as varied as in 20,000 Leagues, which I enjoyed more. I think 20,000 Leagues is more epic in scope. There are more wonders to behold. But perhaps setting up that as a point of comparison, it's always going to be hard to match. So this book is interesting. It is quite exciting. Lovely character building, as I say, but it's not mind-blowing. There were also some sections which I felt were a bit dry. Like, for example, when the professor and his nephew are expounding their various scientific theories. Overall, it's a very well-written adventure story, good solid read, holds up quite well for its age. I just don't think this is the pinnacle of Verne's work. So I'm going to say 3.5 stars for this one. And now for the next book. Something a lot more recent. The Lesson. This is a 2019 release by Cadwell Turnbull, and it was his debut novel. The Lesson is the third book that was recommended to me in my Hidden Gems of Sci-Fi series of books, which I did a video on, out of a total of 10 books, which I'm gradually working my way through. So, I really enjoyed this one. It was very rich and an enjoyable read. Now, the setting of The Lesson feels very fresh in that it's a science fiction story set in the Caribbean, specifically the US Virgin Islands. That's not something I've come across before, and I'm quite keen to explore more SF stories outside your typical settings, and also from authors from different parts of the world. So in this book, it's essentially a first contact story. It's an alien invasion tale in which we've got a very advanced and powerful alien race that come to occupy the island of St. Thomas. It's got some intriguing sci-fi concepts and explores some deep themes. And it's also a very character-driven story. And another thing I like about it is that the prose flows very nicely, very smoothly. The characters feel very vivid and believable. And I would say it's just a book that's very easy to read, very enjoyable to read. if I compare it with the last two books, Jules Verne and Bob Shaw, they were both great writers, but I find their prose difficult to read in long stretches. It takes me a little while to finish one of their books. Whereas in this book, Turnbull does such a good job of portraying the characters and their relationships with each other, their experiences and their reactions to the alien occupation. He does this in such an effortless and compelling way that it immediately holds the reader's attention, and it doesn't let you go until the end. And it's got a very thrilling conclusion. But let's talk a bit about the story, the premise. So the majority of the novel is set a few years after the arrival of a mysterious alien race called the Ina. I'm not quite sure if that's the correct pronunciation. It's spelled Ynaa. Anyway, the Ina, they arrived on the island in a spaceship from another planet. And there is a great deal of mystery over the nature of the Ina and where they're from and their reason for being there. Their science and technology is far beyond human levels. They are physically very strong, and they can morph into human form, and they can easily acquire human languages. In fact, we seldom get to see what the alien's true form looks like, as they always appear to islanders in their human disguise. Although we do learn that they appear to be a semi-aquatic species who have tentacles and gills in their true form. And there's also some ambivalence over whether their arrival on the island actually constitutes an invasion or not, since after they arrived on the island, they claimed to arrive in peace, and that their mission was to use the island to carry out some research, and that they would leave Earth within a few years in the same state that they found it, which sounds reasonable enough. The nature of their research they won't disclose, though, but in return for the humans' cooperation, they offer to share some of their advanced technology, which gives us new cures for diseases like cancer and energy technologies that can solve Earth's sustainability problems. So it actually sounds like quite a good deal. However, there is in fact a very uneasy relationship with the islanders. While the Ina appear benevolent, they in fact get angered very easily, and when provoked, the consequences can be devastating. They typically react with shocking and disproportionate violence, and this can result in death. So this is not very good for their PR, as you might imagine. And every time an incident like this happens, it sets the community on edge, and hostility to the aliens grows. However, these aliens are so strong and so powerful, the islanders are essentially powerless, and they have little choice but to accept their presence until they leave. So this tension keeps growing and growing, and it's obvious that at some point a big conflict is going to happen, and that's inevitable. So this drama is explored through the point of view of a number of islanders who, as I said, are pretty compelling and fleshed out characters. I won't talk about these characters in detail because there's quite a long list. There's quite a few of them, but they are all very interesting. And this book is very well written, I think. It's well paced. It's very easy to read. And while it is a science fiction story, there are actually a number of genres in here. It combines several different genres. There are elements of YA, for example, because some of the protagonists are quite young and we explore their lives. We've got historical fiction. One of the characters is writing a book about the history of colonialism on the islands, and we get some quite detailed historical accounts of slave rebellions in the 18th century. So obviously the theme of colonization, both past and present, is a significant thread throughout the narrative. We also get elements of horror, which creep up into the story every now and then. Remember, these are tentacled aliens wrapped in human form with a propensity to extreme violence. So obviously horror is going to come up at some point. All in all, it's a great read, a refreshing read. I definitely enjoyed it. If I have any criticism of this book, I'd say perhaps there are too many POV characters. There's so many characters get introduced, it can get a bit confusing sometimes. And sometimes I think like these new characters get introduced in the second half of the book. And I think the aim is to add depth to the story. But I think they're a bit unnecessary, and I would have preferred if the author stuck to the main characters and had more of a tightly focused cast. But this is a fairly minor criticism. The character work is very interesting in this book. So it's a solid and entertaining read and a fresh and intelligent take on the classic alien invasion narrative. So I'm giving this a score of 4 stars. And that completes the book review trio. So let's just have a quick discussion of what I'm reading next. I think my next Hidden Gems of Sci-Fi book that I'll read from that list will be Lagoon by Nnedi Okorafor. And this is kind of continuing the theme of science fiction from other parts of the world which we perhaps don't usually associate with sci-fi. In this case, this story is set in Nigeria. So I look forward to reading that. I also have another book, The Four-Dimensional Nightmare. So I held another poll on my channel asking people which classic sci-fi short story collection should I read next. And this one won. Out of a total of 48 votes, 54% voted for The Four-Dimensional Nightmare by J.G. Ballard. This is one that I picked up just recently in my last book haul, and I believe this is the same collection as Voices of Time, which is his other title, which is quite highly regarded, I think. At least I had a very good review of it. And all that remains now is to nominate a third book via the BookSpinner. Okay then, now you can see that the list of books here has grown quite a bit since I picked up a whole load of vintage books from my recent book haul. Let's see what the next one's going to be. The Time Machine and Other Stories. Okay, so this is one among my H.G. Wells box set collection. There are 5 books in this collection. I've read all of them except for this one. The Time Machine and Other Stories. The Time Machine is, of course, an absolute classic within the genre. So let's see what it says on the back. The Time Machine and Other Stories. H.G. Wells' first novel, The Time Machine, is rightly held to be one of the classic works of science fiction. In this fascinating collection, it is accompanied by a selection of Wells' most entertaining short stories, including The Stolen Bacillus, a timely warning of the dangers of science, and The Country of the Blind, which brilliantly captures life in a strange world. This fine assortment showcases the enigmatic mind of one of Britain's most talented writers. Wells' tales are as powerful and meaningful today as when they were first published more than a century ago. Great. I do like H.G. Wells' writing, and I look forward to reading that. So, that's the next 3 books decided. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you again soon.